Hey, if you're a fan of Ozzy Osbourne or Black Sabbath, I think you're going to enjoy today's video. Now, the thing that triggered me to want to make this particular video today, believe it or not, was an article that I found in the New York Times. Now, this was printed, this came out a few weeks ago, but I just found it, and I saw this and I thought, man, this brings up a question, this long-standing question I've had about Ozzy Osbourne specifically. And the question is, why? Because if you follow this channel for any length of time, you know that one of my favorite topics is Black Sabbath. I mean, you go back into the 70s with Ozzy. I love that stuff. I love talking about it. You get into the Dio era. Anyway, I'm fascinated by Black Sabbath. I love talking about them. And then recently we had that big event, which was kind of the farewell to Black Sabbath. And let's be honest. Yes, it was paying homage to all the Black Sabbath music and that them as a band, as a unit. But at the core of all of it, even was just Ozzy. And part of the way you know that because of the fact that part of the show was him, and it was people playing his music, not just the Black Sabbath stuff, but the Ozzy solo stuff. And so, I mean, and then you look, here they were having this final event, and look at all the people they were able to bring together for that. I mean, it's astonishing. As far even Tobias Forge, the singer for Ghost. I mean. And I like Ghost. I think they have some great music. And it's such a cool band and such a cool concept. But even he was there. Even he was there paying homage to Ozzy. He played, I think he was planning on playing some Sabbath stuff, but he ended up doing Bark at the Moon. So anyway, let me get back to the question. One of the things that kind of fascinates me is the whole idea of who Ozzy Osbourne became. Like he's this kind of ubiquitous and pervasive presence just in popular culture. And one of the things that fascinates me about this guy is that if I went up to my mom and I were to ask her any series of famous rock stars from the 70s, because that's kind of after her era, she probably wouldn't know who any of them were. Then you get into the 80s and 90s, and if I started saying some of these names, she wouldn't know anybody, right? Just because it's not her generation. But if I were to mention here in 2025, if I were to say the words Ozzy Osbourne, she'd know who he was. And that just is so unbelievable to me thinking about that. What was it? What was it about him? Was it one thing? Was it a combination of things? Why is it, of all the people, of all the rock stars from that era, what is it about him that here we are all these years later? I mean, we're talking about from the time of their first album, 55 years. And his name is known, kind of like I said, this pervasive presence in popular culture. And then when you step back and you take him in the context of everything else that was going on at the time, why him? And that's the question. That's the overall question here. Because then you look back at some of his contemporaries. So like Robert Plant, for example. I think, again, I'm just kind of putting this in this sense of what would my mother know? If I went up to her and I said, have you ever heard the name Robert Plant? She probably hasn't. Now, if she had, it'd most likely be because I'm around, and if you ever get in a room with me for more than 5 minutes, you're going to end up in a conversation about rock music. So if she did know who Robert Plant was, it would be probably because of that, but she probably wouldn't know who he was. And here he was. Robert Plant is the consummate rock star. He's good looking. He's got this great voice. He's got this great hair. He's got this striking presence. And you think, what is it that my mom wouldn't know who he was, but she would know who Ozzy is, who is kind of the opposite. Ozzy's a little bit frumpy, and he's just doesn't have that Greek god chiseled look kind of that you have with Robert Plant. Same thing with David Lee Roth, a little bit later in the 70s. But again, this really good looking guy, this incredible presence on stage. Like at that time, you read all the books about the early days of Van Halen, when they were doing their backyard parties and what have you. All the women wanted David Lee Roth. Everybody had a crush on him. Everybody was in love with him. That wasn't the way it was with Ozzy. And yet, if you ask my mom who's David Lee Roth, probably wouldn't have any idea. Again, go back and more contemporaries. Mark Farner from Grand Funk. You think she'd know who Mark Farner is? No way. Go back to Ian Gillan from Deep Purple, another contemporary. Would she know who Ian Gillan is? Again, no. What about Steven Tyler? Maybe because he was on, was he on America's Got Talent or something? She might know who he was, but only because of that. Would she know Gene Simmons or Paul Stanley? Maybe, again, because of me, because I was a kid that loved Kiss. Would she know who Alice Cooper is? Maybe she'd know that name. But again, that's not even his real name, because what Alice Cooper, by his own admission, was just a vaudeville act. And so it was this whole, with good music behind it, but he'll even tell you it was all vaudeville. It was all this big show. So, but Ozzy didn't have anything like that. Paul Rodgers, again, she wouldn't know who he was. And he was this massive star back then. This good-looking dude, great voice. Now, what about another contemporary that would have been also maybe kind of in the hard rock world? Freddie Mercury? Yeah, she'd know who Freddie Mercury was. And because Freddie Mercury, again, this legendary songwriter, singer, and he was... of course, they were almost forgotten, but then they had the big comeback in Live Aid, and then they became kind of legends. But she'd probably know who Freddie Mercury is. Another one she'd probably know from that area would be David Bowie, although it's not really hard rock, but she'd probably know who he was. So here we are in 2025, and if I went to my mom and I said, do you know who David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, or Ozzy Osbourne? And she'd know those three and probably nobody else. How does Ozzy, this frumpy kid from Birmingham, 55 years later, be on the tip of the tongue of somebody from a totally different generation, and probably my kids too would know who Ozzy was, and they'd know probably Freddie Mercury, and they might know David Bowie, but they wouldn't know any of the rest. Well, they might, because they're my kids and I lectured them when they were kids. But the normal kids with normal parents wouldn't know. And he wasn't this master musician like Freddie Mercury. He didn't have this godlike voice that he did. David Bowie, he didn't have this kind of all over the place reinventing yourself. Yes, Ozzy reinvented himself a little bit, but nothing like David Bowie. That he was in a totally different level from anybody else. And yet Ozzy's in that, on that plane. Okay, so you're following me here. Okay, so what got me thinking about this, and the reason I want to talk about it, is because I've been asking this question for years. I'll just find myself, like a lot of you probably do, sometime in the late night conversations going, what, asking these questions about these famous people and philosophizing about it or whatever. And Ozzy, and so I came across this article in the New York Times that was just put out a couple weeks ago, and it's 5 musicians on why Ozzy Osbourne is genuine metal royalty. And I thought this would be interesting because you actually have some people from the industry that maybe kind of attempt to answer this question. And when you look at Ozzy from a storyline standpoint, because a lot of these guys are looking at him from all the way back in the early days, from the Black Sabbath time. Now, for me, the first time I heard of Ozzy Osbourne was, I know a lot, just like a lot of you, and I know the only reason I know this is because we've made other videos and people have commented and communicated with me about it. The first time we're hearing about Ozzy Osbourne is in that Blizzard of Ozz, Diary of a Madman timetable. And because I remember for me specifically, every day I'd go into my math class, I was in junior high at the time, some stoner kid would come into the classroom every day and he'd write Ozzy up on the board. And I didn't know who Ozzy was. I just see that name and then I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is important apparently that I know who Ozzy is. And I don't know why the teacher let him come in and do it every single day. And maybe you were one of those people that would go write that on chalkboards in your classroom, Ozzy. But he just kind of had this almost cult-like attraction to people that you just knew his name, and maybe that was part of it, that he had this name, Ozzy, and that you could chant, and it had it almost had this rhythm. But when you go backwards, so again, for me and for a lot of you, this is when we're first hearing of him. And then our first experience with Black Sabbath then was with Dio. singing the song Mob Rules on the heavy metal soundtrack. That's the first time I ever really heard my first Black Sabbath song. And then you later make the connection, wait a minute, Ozzy? Okay, and again, you're 12, 13, 11, whatever, and you're just graduating from Kiss, and you're just starting to learn all this stuff. But then you go back and you look at Ozzy, especially the trajectory of it, because it even makes it so fascinating. Because of course they got together back in the late 60s. And you'd hear the stories. I think it's Tony Iommi talks about how I think the first time Ozzy showed up to a rehearsal, he didn't even own a pair of shoes. So these are poor kids in an industrial part of England that was still recovering from World War II. And music is maybe a way to get out of here, to create something. And so then he shows up, they put this band together that becomes Black Sabbath. They put that first album out in 1970, February 13th of 1970. And then think of what happened. It basically took 8 years. They became one of the biggest things in the world. And there were a lot of huge bands back then, like Grand Funk, which I mentioned earlier. And who even knows who Grand Funk is anymore? I mean, there's some, me, you probably, but you go to the world at large, they don't know. And yet they were huge. They had records for filling up stadiums, like Shea Stadium. They had the record for selling that place out. They were huge at the time of Black Sabbath. But all these bands kind of just disappeared. They faded away. And Black Sabbath actually was one of those bands that just they got huge, giant band. And then they got to 1978. They put out Never Say Die. And everybody was looking at them kind of like a washed up group. And so then Black Sabbath, they're kind of losing faith in themselves. And Ozzy now has become this messed up druggie. They finally have to kick him out of the band. And so now he's got, all his insecurities, and he doesn't believe in himself. And he's now, his whole identity, which was Black Sabbath, is gone. And he's kind of lost. And then, of course, he discovers, this guitarist, Randy Rhoads. There's a whole story behind, these two guys meeting each other. And then Ozzy, puts this band together where they create these two albums kind of in sequence, which was, as we talked about a little while ago, Blizzard of Ozz and Diary of a Madman, which they basically recorded at the same time. And Blizzard of Ozz creates this song, Crazy Train, which today, go to a sporting event and you're probably going to hear the beginning of that song. It just kind of became this universal tune that here we are now, whatever that would be, 45 years later after that thing came out, that thing is still, everybody knows that song. So here he was, a washed up rock star in a washed up band, and he somehow, like a phoenix, rose from the ashes, became this huge rock star. And you might say, well, it was because of Randy, because he discovered this guitarist, this is savant, almost musician, kind of like on the level of Eddie Van Halen, some would say, of just his amazing talent. And he was able to craft all these songs with Ozzy and for Ozzy that put him out on the map and gave him that, that resurrected him from being this washed up, drug addicted rock star. And then, of course, around this, this same time period, he marries Sharon Arden, who becomes, Sharon Osbourne. And maybe she's part of the reason that he took it. But then, then he puts those two albums out, and then Randy Rhoads dies in March of 1982. And then what do we have now? Ozzy then is kind of his partner is now gone. And what is he going to do? Well, then he retreats to playing Black Sabbath stuff. He gets Brad Gillis from Night Ranger. They come put out Speak of the Devil, because that's he goes back to his old world of Black Sabbath. And it does, okay, it does pretty well as far as sales go. But then Brad Gillis takes off, and then he starts going through this rotation of guitar players. Jakey Lee comes in, and then after having the stumble of losing Randy, then he kind of gets back up on his feet, and then they put out Bark at the Moon, and then The Ultimate Sin, and then of course Zakk Wylde comes in. You have this new guitar god who happens to also be a good songwriter and actually a really good singer, and then he comes in and again kind of brings Ozzy out. And creates this almost new, because you remember when No More Tears came out, just this, all of a sudden it was like Ozzy's back again, or he's here still, or something. And this music is so cool, and this guitar playing, it just like every new guitarist he gets has this new amazingness to it. And then you bring Zach, and then he's the one that kind of, has been maybe there for really, really the long haul. And then it was just a few years after that, he retires. He goes on his No More Tours tour. I saw him on that tour. He's done. There's no more. And then he doesn't stay retired. He keeps going. And then all of a sudden we have Ozzfest. I mean, sorry, I keep going on this, but it's just such a fascinating thing. And then this Ozzfest, where it's like the central figure of this is the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne. And now his whole career is resurrected again. And then it goes, Black Sabbath kind of comes back, and then Heaven and Hell goes off, and then they play with Dio again, and then Ozzy's kind of around and whatever, and then Black Sabbath comes back and does this massive tour, and so it just culminates on, and then of course somewhere in there he does that TV show, The Osbournes, and all this stuff, and so you look at all these different little pieces. And somehow every single one of these, and maybe it wasn't just one thing, maybe it's a combination of all of it, but somehow this kind of frumpy poor kid from Birmingham who didn't have any particularly amazing musical skills, not like David Bowie or Freddie Mercury, he just could kind of sing, and he had this interesting presence on stage, but it wasn't like he was Robert Plant. He didn't have this striking, handsome thing that you associate with rock stars. I mean, at one point, he shaved his head. You never saw Robert Plant do that. And then when Black Sabbath got back together at Live Aid, it was like nobody even noticed. So it wasn't like it wasn't like the homecoming of the greatest band in the world. It was like there was a lot of meh that happened at that time. Anyway, I went way too long on this issue, but the ultimate question, and I want to make another video about this from your feedback. What was it about him? And now I'm going to read this article to you now and share this with you, because it is kind of it's so fascinating again to me, this topic of what was it about this guy? Going back to my mom, that if I could list all those other rock stars, she probably wouldn't know any of them, but she would know this frumpy kid from Birmingham that sang for Black Sabbath. She'd know him 55 years later. Amazing to me. Okay, here we go. So 5 musicians on why Ozzy Osbourne is genuine metal royalty. If you're still watching this right now, you're as nerdy about this stuff as I am, because I just find this stuff so interesting. So I've got my New York Times subscription here, and the reason I do is I did a show with Gary a few weeks ago where we were trying to read something, and you could only get to it if you had a subscription. So I threw my $4 in or whatever, and I still have the subscription. So I thought I'm just going to use it today on this video. So here we go. 5 musicians on why Ozzy Osbourne is genuine metal royalty. As the Prince of Darkness prepares for his final concert with Black Sabbath, admirers including Lars Ulrich, Lita Ford, and Billy Corgan extol his virtues. Okay, and then there's a picture of Ozzy on the screen. All right, Ozzy Osbourne has persisted for so long in pop culture and reemerged in so many different guises, including fiendish hard rock ringleader and bewildered Beverly Hills dad, that it's easy to lose sight of the core of his fame. His bone-chilling work with Black Sabbath in the 70s up through his surprisingly nuanced solo material in the 80s and beyond have helped define the sound and persona of the heavy metal frontman. Despite a pair of well-received recent albums, Osbourne performances have been scarce in recent years as he has battled with health issues including Parkinson's disease and emphysema. On Saturday, at a day-long event in his Birmingham, England hometown, the 76-year-old musician will appear both solo and with his original Black Sabbath bandmates. The guitarist, Tony Iommi, the bassist, Terrence Butler, known as Geezer, and the drummer, Bill Ward, at what's being billed as his last ever concert. The lineup for the event, and again, this is the point I made a little while ago. Yes, it was all about Black Sabbath, but in a lot of ways, it was really about Ozzy, because he's at the core of somehow all of this stuff. The lineup for the event, dreamed up by Sharon Osbourne, has his wife and manager, reads like a roll call of some of the biggest names in metal and hard rock, including Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Slayer, and Tool. Its musical director is Rage Against the Machine's Tom Morello. Quote, "I can tell you that if we weren't invited to play, I would find a way to be there anyway, even if I had to sneak in under the fence line," the Metallica drummer Lars Ulrich said. "I think it's pretty safe to say that if there was no Black Sabbath, there would be no Metallica." Ulrich's sense of debt to Osbourne is widely shared, both in the worlds of heavy guitar-based music and far beyond. Ozzy is one of the most remarkable singers and performers of our time. Elton John, who was a guest of Osbourne's 2020 album, Ordinary Man, wrote in an email, "He has an amazing voice and has done so much for metal." Again, Elton John commenting on Ozzy Osbourne. The ubiquity of who he became is fascinating to me. In separate interviews via phone and email, 5 hard rock luminaries reflected on Osbourne's career and impact ahead of his final show. Ulrich, the singer-guitarist Lita Ford, who collaborated with Osbourne on the heart-wrenching late 80s ballad Close My Eyes Forever, the Smashing Pumpkins leader Billy Corgan, and Judas Priest frontman Rob Halford, and the Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee. These are edited excerpts from the conversations. And there's a picture of Lars right there. "I grew up in Copenhagen, and I saw Black Sabbath in 77. In Denmark, you were getting a lot of British pop rock like Sweet and Slade and Alvin Stardust and the Rhoads, and Black Sabbath was so to the left of that. Music at that time, especially in the harder rock world, was a lot about ability, guys that were really singing and screaming. With Ozzy, you really felt that he was more like a messenger, or he was the vessel that transmitted those words. It was a different kind of communication. It had a different level of authenticity to it. And so that's one of the things. Part of what, when you think about Ozzy Osbourne, there is a certain level of authenticity to it in the sense that he just seems so almost normal. There's something about him where he is this poor kid from Birmingham, and there's something about his presence that you kind of sense that. And maybe part of the reason is that he doesn't feel like a Greek god. Maybe it's a little bit more like why Meatloaf is a household name, not the food, the singer, but similar. You know, he was this overweight dude, and he'd wear that tuxedo, but he had this crazy singing voice and this very interesting X factor that probably was built on the fact that he was so opposite of what you expected. And maybe there's a little bit of that in the mix here too. Let's see, different kind of communication, different kind of authenticity to it. Black Sabbath almost felt more like a mirror to what was going on in society. So when they were singing about Vietnam or war pigs or napalm in protesting or about institutional authority, it had a different sense of reality. And that's actually an interesting thing too, because so many people pin on Black Sabbath, you know, the dark magic, satanic kind of thing on top of them. But when you listen to people, especially like Geezer Butler, talking about the lyrics, because he was largely the lyricist back in those days, he was really writing. When you have to put it in context. They were at the height of the Vietnam War at that time, and in so many ways, the world felt like a scary, ugly place. You know, with death and destruction and chaos. And so the words, and then again, they were coming from this poor kind of industrial part of England where it was all surrounded by machinery and people felt like they were stuck and they couldn't get out, and it was poor. And so the lyrics really reflected that. That's what was going on. Today we see them, we have a hard time, maybe we don't see them through those eyes anymore, but that's what was happening in the world around them at the time, and explains a little bit more about the words that were being said by these guys. And as he said there, and interestingly, in some ways, maybe Ozzy was the messenger. Okay, let's see here. Almost felt like a mirror to what was going on. I think when all the fans looked at Ozzy, you felt like he was at the same level as you. and he was a mirror of you. It was almost like he was a precursor to the punk rock that was coming a few years later, where there was an element of like, I could do that. I could be that person, unquote. Sharon and Ozzy were so gracious to let us be a part of their 1986 tour. It was great, obviously, just to be in the company of a legend of that level who was very much directly responsible for us even existing as a band. The fact that they believed in that enough to let us share the stage with him was crazy. And that is kind of a fascinating thing too, because when you look back at those tours, Ozzy, it sounds as though him and Black Sabbath specifically were very gracious in some ways, because when you look at the time that Van Halen was opening up for Black Sabbath, you know, in the kind of the later days of Black Sabbath, of course, Ozzy would openly say, yeah, Van Halen was blowing us off the stage every day. Kind of like very secure in who he was in his position, or he was just kind of a normal guy that was just being honest about things and wasn't trying to say, we were the greatest, we blew up. No, he was pretty clear, like, yeah, they were better than us most of the time. And there's something kind of human and kind of, I don't know what it is about that, but there's this weird humility that comes along with being able to say that. And maybe that's part of the thing too. Anyway, just more stuff. So Lita Ford, the first show I ever saw was Black Sabbath, and it was absolutely life-changing. I was a huge fan at the time because, of course, I grew up with all the old Black Sabbath records, Paranoid and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and I learned how to play all those riffs. I came away from that concert thinking, oh, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to make people feel like this band, Black Sabbath, is making me feel today. And that's a pretty interesting thing, because so many people, that was their connection to them, was like there was something about, a little bit like the way you hear people talk about Led Zeppelin when they'd go to their concert, like it was this otherworldly experience. And it seems that a lot of people that saw Black Sabbath in those early days had a similar experience. And if you saw them during that period, I'd love to hear about that too. Please put that down in the comments. We all know Ozzy is a huge Paul McCartney fan. He loves that Beatles stuff, all the melodic harmonies. That's where he comes from, his upbringing. And I think with Close My Eyes Forever, it was such a natural, effortless writing collaboration that we did. There was no pressure, quote, oh yeah, you have to write a top 10 hit single, unquote. No, we were just having a good time that night, and we happened to have come up with the song. Mike Chapman, the producer, brought the song to life. He put us in the studio, and we sang it together. We actually put a plexiglass plate in front of us, and we sang face to face. Ozzy just sang it so effortlessly. And honestly, that's a pretty powerful tune. You know, and you have the two of them singing it together, and it's pretty awesome. He is a talent, that's for sure. He's a great singer. With all the craziness in his world, I think people overlook that fact. That he, you know, again, that he is the Prince of Darkness, but we forget that he's actually a really, really good singer, really talented guy. Okay, then we have Billy Corgan. He's an interesting dude, just alone. But the fact he was a huge Black Sabbath fan. I first heard Black Sabbath, The Master of Reality, when I was 8 years old, and have been chasing that sound as a musician ever since. What drew me to them was this sense of cosmic ennui and a shadowy warmth that is only theirs. Ozzy, one of the greatest singers of all time of hard rock and ballads, as well as a great songwriter, has a one-of-a-kind rapport with fans, and his endurance is tied to this affection that we have for him and he with us. For me, it's his voice. All the other intangibles are there in a star. But his voice is a singular vehicle like Lennon or Sinatra, in that it conveys emotions and hues beyond the lyric being sung. Impossible to quantify, but unmissable. And that's, again, it's that whole like X Factor thing. That when you have somebody like this, there's just something that sometimes you just can't even explain it. And when you listen to, I remember the first time that I heard the song Black Sabbath, you know, and when his voice comes in and says that, what is this that stands before me? And it's just so odd. And it's just creepy and interesting, and it kind of pulls you into it. It's amazing. So there really was something about that kind of guttural thing that he would do when he would sing that just felt so real. So anyway, like he says there, the intangibles, but impossible to quantify, but unmissable. I would say Goodbye to Romance is the signature Ozzy song, because it was Ozzy busting out from the disappointment and heartache of being fired by Sabbath and claiming his own greatness too. It shows his range, his heart, and his willingness to take immense chances, a career-defining song. And just think about this. He was that close to being completely forgotten. Because when he got kicked out of Black Sabbath and he'd kind of lost his confidence, he didn't believe in himself, he didn't know what he was going to do, he was strung out on, I mean, he was just this washed up rock star druggie. And he could have, like a lot of people in that position, could have just disappeared into the gutter and forgotten, where all these years later, be like, remember that? Who? I don't remember it. But instead, he's a household name. That's the thing that gets me. It's so interesting. Let's see. There isn't a single thing in my own music that hasn't been touched by the immense shadow of Ozzy's approach to singing and Tony Iommi's approach to guitar. I am forever in their debt. And that's Billy Corgan. Okay, so now Rob Halford of Judas Priest. If we think about where Ozzy began with Black Sabbath, he laid his platform of uniqueness during those early tours. And then when he was away from Sabbath, I know I was thinking, well, what's he going to do next? I always remain focused on Ozzy, the singer. I think he's got an amazing voice, and I've always felt that Ozzy was a little bit overlooked in that area because of all the other stuff. So as a musician, as a singer in the songs and the albums, he is remarkable and one of a kind. And it is, even though, like I said, he didn't have the big vaudeville act that an Alice Cooper did, he did have those little legendary things. Because when they say all the other stuff, I mean, you had the legends of the biting the dove head off, and the bat, and then how that just kind of grew into just all these legends of all these different things. So some of the stuff that surrounded Ozzy, a lot of it wasn't even real, because those things that did happen kind of turned into these bigger than life things that weren't even true, but it just created this legend of this character. And then people became more and more focused on the interesting stuff of him from a popular culture standpoint, rather than just the fact that he's actually a really interesting singer. Okay. Let's see, remarkable, one of a kind. Ozzy always talked about himself and the messages and the world like everybody could understand it. It was as though he was your friend, but you were terrified to meet him. He's a working man's everyman in the musical sense, and that's a really important part of his legacy. His nonstop reference to his fans, how much he loves his fans, he feels he never can give his fans enough. When he walks on stage, your eyes never leave him. There's very few front men that can do that. He wraps his arms around 20,000 people in that arena, and he touches every single person. And I think I talked about that a minute ago. If you ever see him in concert, there was something about that. And it was kind of sad, that he's in that position now on that last show where he had to sit in that chair. But because part of what made him so interesting was just almost the manic nature of how he would act on stage, like constantly telling people to go crazy, go crazy. And he's always doing his arms and making people clap. And then it was so funny. You'd watch him because he'd start putting his mic on the stand and he'd take it off and on and off and on and off and on and off. And it's almost comical watching how he would do that. But there was kind of an interesting charm to it all too. Just the way he would present himself, the almost chaotic energy that came from that stage presence. And like he said, he had this ability in front of 20,000 people that you're just kind of arrested on this guy, that he's the guy. So, all right, so Tommy Lee of Motley Crue. Ozzy is a real big reason why we're still here. I can't emphasize enough how generous he was when we toured together in the early 80s. Usually headliners reserve a bunch of lights and give openers a fraction of the PA system, so the opening band isn't as loud as the headlining act. Ozzy was like, you can have all the lights, have all the sound, have a expletive blast, unquote. And that really moved me. I never really experienced that sort of generosity and equality that he wanted for everybody. And that gets back to what I think I was saying something about Van Halen a little while ago. I ramble so much I sometimes forget what I said 2 minutes ago, but when they were touring with Van Halen, they weren't afraid of Van Halen. You have so many bands that have these opening groups and they go out of their way to kind of suppress them a little bit. And, you go back to those days with Black Sabbath with Van Halen open up, and Van Halen was the up-and-comers, and they were a lot of people were coming to see them. And rather than getting defensive, at least from Ozzy's standpoint, you can, there's other stories with Tony and whatever, but Ozzy seemed to have this attitude like, yeah, they've blown us off the stage all the time. And like he was aware of it and was okay with admitting it. So, and similarly, when Motley Crue, at least according to Tommy Lee, when they were touring with them, there was no holding back. It's like, hey, we let you guys do whatever you want to do, put on, have fun and put on a good show. All right. He was this sort of he has this sort of signature move. He kind of jumps in one place and claps. Yeah, that's so true. It's there's this weird charm to the weirdness of his manic stage presence. It was always kind of fun and interesting. There's an evil, let's see here, kind of jumps in one place. There's an evil smirk on his face as he's doing it, but I think the evil smirk is happiness because the place is going bananas. It's letting the audience know that you are enjoying it just as much or more than they are. That's connecting with people. That's connections. That connection's important, man. Otherwise, you're just kind of doing it for yourself. I remember when the Osbournes first came out, I was like, holy expletive, this is cool. This is letting people into his crazy train, unquote. That's when reality television was blowing up. And I think a lot of people, and especially young people that were watching that show, probably had no clue he was in Black Sabbath by then. The guy just keeps coming back and not reinventing himself, but finding other ways to get people to have fun on and off the stage. And that's, again, that is kind of my point, because you look at somebody like David Bowie and you really do have reinvention. I mean, he was the consummate reinventor. There's nobody that did it like he did. And Ozzy wasn't that. It was a little bit of the rising from the ashes in some way over and over again. And, we gave some examples of that somehow he just keeps coming back and maybe slightly different with a slightly different direction, surrounding himself with the right people, being at the right place at the right time, having the right song, having the right energy or whatever. Again, the whole question here that I wanted to get out of you, and I'd love to get your feedback on this down in the comments. What was it? In your opinion, was it a combination of things? Was it one specific thing? Was it timing? Was it the people he surrounded himself with? Again, I've had this conversation with so many people before, but it always fascinates me because there's so many moving pieces. There's so many parts to it that this one guy, again, getting all the way back to how we started. If I were to go to my mom and say, do you know who Robert Plant is? Who probably is one of the most iconic, legendary rock singers of all time. So many people based everything they do on him. Same thing with David Lee Roth. So many people built their entire persona around, studying David Lee Roth. And then there's Ozzy. And he's the one that everybody remembers. 55 years later. He's the one. Not the Greek god, not the sex symbol, not these people that you would think this is what a rock star looks like and how they act and who they are. No, it's Ozzy. He's the one everybody remembers. I'm repeating myself, I know, but it's amazing and interesting to me. So please leave your comments on this topic. I'd love to hear your feedback on this, what you think about it. There were some interesting things. We had these five people that had their own comments on what they think it was all about. And I'd love to get your feedback on the same thing. And please follow the channel if you're not already following it. And if you watch the video all the way to this point and you're not following the channel, I don't know what to say, because you are definitely a rock nerd like me. And this is your place. So please follow the channel, leave your comments, and obviously like the video. And also share this video with other people, because if you enjoyed this, you probably know other people that do too. And that's one of the ways that channels like this are able to grow, and then we're able to expand and then bring more hopefully fun and interesting things to you that you'll enjoy, and we're having fun doing it too. So please share this with other people. We really appreciate you when you do that. And of course, with that, have yourself a fantastic day.